Welcome, everybody. So glad you are here today. I'm Pastor Darrell, and I'm privileged to speak to you out of the book of Ruth today, the third in a series that we're doing through that book. And I want to say welcome to everybody in Clovis, New Mexico at Servant's Heart Chapel. God bless each one of you. So glad that you could gather in today, and really looking forward to coming and seeing you guys again. Tony and Sarah and Cornelius and all of his family and Lori, those that I know, those that I haven't met yet, I know through Facebook and things like that. God bless you guys for what you're doing there for the kingdom of God, building it up in Clovis, New Mexico. Today I'm preaching to an empty church and a video camera because we had a technical glitch on Sunday. It doesn't usually happen, but when it does, it's usually my fault, or sometimes. And so I had a sound cable that didn't get plugged in, so you had video but no sound. And I decided that, that probably wasn't the thing that would be a real blessing to you. And so here I am preaching to a bunch of empty chairs today. So I get to talk directly to you today, and I love that because I think I've got something to say to you today that's going to be helpful for those of you who are on the journey toward the Lord. You're on that journey toward heaven, and maybe you're hitting some hiccups. You really want to know how to get to the next level. And I think this is going to be a helpful message about some things, some choices you have to make to get you where you really want to go in your quieter, more serious moments. All right? Ruth chapter 1, if you've studied this story with us so far for the last 2 weeks, then you know that the story of Ruth kind of moves in a cycle, and we're going to talk about that cycle today, kind of a negative cycle that sends them into some difficult, bad choices and a lot of brokenness in their lives. And so we're going to talk about how to get off of that. In fact, if you've studied the book, you can just track with me right down through the scripture there and take notes on that cycle. The first step is this: hard times. Hard times. It's not something that's just easy. In fact, right at the beginning of the book, Elimelech and Naomi are married. They are in the country of Israel, the southern part of Israel, in Bethlehem, and it's hard times. It's difficult days. There's a famine in the land. And as they are struggling to try to meet the needs of their family and raise the crops that they need and get the economic situation of their family straightened out, they decide they make a very difficult and I think a bad decision, and that's the second point, is this: bad choices. Bad choices. A lot of times, hard times, when the bills are due and the money is tight and it's hard to feed the family and everything is tired and your job's not going well, it's really easy to make bad decisions, and that's what they do. They go off to Moab. You can see there on Ruth chapter 1, verse number 3, or verse number 2, the man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. They had 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. They make this journey to Moab, which is a wicked place. It's an idolatry, an idol-infested place where they worship Shemash and other gods of the ancient East, and they do a lot of really awful things involving immorality and sexual perversion and even human and infant sacrifice to these gods. But somehow in Elimelech's mind, in Naomi's mind, this was what needed to happen. Like, you know what? I know we ought to be here with the people of God, but times are hard. Let's take a detour. Have you ever been in that place where you're driving down the interstate and all of a sudden you see a traffic jam up ahead of you? It happened to me this week in Oklahoma City. I'm driving down the road and I see, oh man, there's a traffic jam. It disappears up around the corner. People just brake lights as far as you can see up around the corner, and I real quickly checked my mirror and whipped over and hit an exit ramp. And I got off that exit ramp and I thought, I'm just going to take back roads the rest of the way. I bet you I can beat. In fact, I said to my kids who were with me that morning, I said, I think I can beat it over here. I can go faster this way. I think I missed every single light between there and my destination. At least it felt that way. I was sitting at red light after red light after red light, just frustrated. And the shortcut turned into the long cut. And that's exactly what happened to Elimelech and Naomi. In fact, they get off this exit ramp, off the will of God, and it takes them, it says in the text, they went to live there for a short time. 10 years later, fast forward, and you find them still in Moab. You find them still making choices to stay there, because once you go, it's hard to make it back sometimes. It's hard to go back to your original plan. And this is just one lesson that we can draw out of this. When you take a detour off of God's will, you take that exit ramp, it almost always will keep you longer and cost you more than you thought it would. Almost every single time. Now, maybe quickly you decide you're going to suddenly come back and go, but a lot of times you just tend to wander and kind of get lost out in there somewhere. And eventually, maybe you make it back. I think that you want to make it back, and that's why you're here today. So I want to tell you the third thing that happens: broken lives. You see, hard times lead to bad choices, and bad choices lead to broken lives every single time. Now, it might not break you physically, although it might. Whatever addiction or sickness or whatever, it might break you physically, the choices that you made before. It might not break you physically, but it might break you financially. All of a sudden, decisions that you made, problems that happened, lies that were told, in a lack of integrity that was developed, it has consequences down the road. You take a shortcut, you take a detour off the road of God's will, and it leads to a lot of brokenness. If it doesn't break you physically or financially, a lot of times it'll break you relationally, and all of a sudden, man, it's a tangled mess of relationships, and there's exes and there's stepkids and his, hers, and ours, and people are, it's awkward, and you can't talk to that person, you can't go there, and you used to have this friend and now it's broken. You understand what I'm saying? Things get really mixed up, and a lot of brokenness results out of those bad choices, those detours out of the will of God. Don't make them. Don't make them. But the point of Ruth is, what if we've already made them? Okay, this is really bad news. So the first three things I have to share here, that's the bad news of the book of Ruth. The good news starts right when you hit the bottom of this cycle. When it seems like, it's going bad, it's going south in a hurry, and you hit the bottom of the cycle, all of a sudden, number 4, God calls. God's calling happens. And when God's calling happens, it seems like it's just right at the bottom of the cycle, and it's a hard day, it's a difficult moment, our lives are broken, and then God calls. And in Naomi and Elimelech's case, Elimelech dies, Mahlon and Chilion die. They're married to Moabite girls by this time. There's just so much relational brokenness, and now they're tied into these families, and they're married to Moabite people that were so wicked that God said even to the 10th generation they're not allowed into the congregation of the Lord. They're not supposed to be added to the people of God. And so there's this huge amount of brokenness, and right in the middle of that, after they've lost husbands and sons, and all of a sudden, God calls. Naomi hears that back in Israel, God has visited his people again. Something's happening over there in Bethlehem. Something's happening over there, and it's time for us to make a journey back. At the same time, God is calling to a Moabite girl named Ruth. He's calling to this girl. I don't know what happened. Maybe she'd heard the stories. Maybe she'd heard all the miracles that God had done. Maybe around the campfire in the evenings there had been stories told of the great glory of this God, Yahweh, the God of the Israelites. Maybe those stories had been told. Whatever it was, there was a hunger born in this girl Ruth to know God. And when God calls, here's what happens next. Raw courage rises up. Raw courage. It took raw courage for Ruth to say, I'm leaving everything. I'm going with you. Last week I called it commitment, determination, whatever you want to call it. But raw courage rises up in her. In fact, if you will, these are some of the key verses of the whole book. Would you read with me down in verse number 13. I'm sorry, I didn't go far enough. Actually, it's in verse 16. Naomi says, look, go back to your family. Go back to your gods. Go back to your father's house. In fact, your sister-in-law is going back. She's already gone. Orpah, she said she was going, but she's changed her mind. She's going back. Just go with her. I can't give you a husband. I can't promise you it's going to be easy. I can't raise up another son and have him marry you. And when you get back to Israel, there's no guarantee you're going to find anybody that will marry you. You're a Moabite. And look what Ruth says in verse 16 and 17. Would you read it out loud together with me? 16 and 17. But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." Wow. What commitment, what courage. She says, "I know this road may be hard, but it's the one I want to travel." She felt like it was worth it to make the hard journey. She felt like it was worth it because God was calling her. And I think some of you have reached that point. You know what it's like to hit that exit ramp off of God's will, away from God's people, out of His will for your life, and you know the bad choices that bring brokenness in your life. Difficulty, hard times, brokenness emotionally and spiritually and relationally and financially and even physically. But I will tell you this, you've also heard God's call. That's why you're here today. That's why you're here. I believe that. I think you're here today because you've heard God call to you and say, "I've got something better. I've got something different for you. This is not over. I've got a plan yet. Come back to me. Come back to what you know to be right, what you know to be true." And I think you've heard it, and in you rose up something that said, "I'm going. I'm going. I want to go." Maybe some of you, God's calling you today, right now, and in you rises up something that says, "I need to go with Jesus." If that's you, congratulations. I'm glad. Raw courage rises up in you. Commit like that. Commit like Ruth did. I'm going. If I die, I'm going to die with my face toward heaven. I'm going with Jesus. It's worth it. Now, at this point right here, I'd love to last week I kind of wrapped up right there talking about commitment. But there's another step. There's something beyond commitment. And sometimes people forget that and they get frustrated and discouraged right here, right after the raw courage rises up and they say, "I'm going to go with God." And they say that on a Sunday, at church, and then they go back to work and they discover that just because they became a Christian on Sunday or just because they made a commitment on Sunday doesn't mean that the whole world knows about it and decided to change on Monday. It doesn't all suddenly, everything's different now. Instead, the next step still has to be taken. This is where people forget sometimes that there is still a difficult journey. A difficult journey. Hard times, bad choices lead to broken lives, but God calls and uprises raw courage, and a difficult journey still has to happen. You see, it says in verse 19, "So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem." And this kind of gets glossed over here, but we're probably talking about a journey of 7 to 10 days. Two women all alone. It's about 50 miles if you're making 5 miles a day. It's 7 to 10 days, something like that. I wonder, in fact, I made a mistake in the last couple of messages. I mentioned that it was mostly uphill to Moab, and that's partly true on the west side of the Dead Sea. But if you're coming around the other direction, I was wrong. I had it backwards. It's mostly uphill to Bethlehem. It's like a 2,000-foot elevation climb to go from the Dead Sea, where you're circling around the tip of the Dead Sea, up to Bethlehem. It's mostly uphill. Two women, alone, no man, probably inferior footwear, right? Just by the odds of things. A difficult journey. Hard days. You got to carry it on commitment. When they start, they're either going to go hungry or they're going to have to carry a lot of load with them, the belongings that they have and some food for the trip. And when they get back, who knows what's waiting for them on the other end? The old home place is probably broken down. It's been 10 years. 10 years since they left with no person around the house. Hard days. But guess what? Here's the thing. When the difficult journey is over, and some of you know because you're in that moment right now, aren't you? I mean, stop and say, you're in that moment. You've been in that place where it's like, this is hard. This is not easy. And I understand because I've helped people through that difficult first few days. I've watched them while they came off drugs and DT'd. I've been there. I've done that. And it's a hard journey sometimes. That first segment of time, it can be a challenging thing. Don't give up in that hard journey. Face the hard journey. Just understand it. Embrace the fact it's going to be hard. It's going to be difficult. And then move on. Push on. But here's the thing. Did you notice it goes in a circle? It goes all the way up, and there's an arrow that goes right back to hard times. They're right back where they started. They need food to feed the family. They're just more broken than they were when they left. They're right back where they started, just more broken than before. This is amazing. They go on a difficult journey, and you get back and you kind of think, okay, now I've been doing right for a few days. I've been chasing the Lord. I've been seeking after Him. Everything should be going fine, and they're right back where they started. Now, let me draw a lesson out of this for you, because I think this is important. A lot of times, when you travel with the Lord and you go to follow Him and you've taken a detour off of His will, a lot of times when you get lost out there and then you come back, you wind up starting back at the same place that you left. The same choices that you made the wrong way the first time, you just about have to come back and make those choices over again. Last time I decided, because of the stress, because of the difficulty, because of what I was in, I'm going to disobey. I'm going to seek solace in something else. I'm going to seek comfort and relief from the stress in something else. I'm going to make a bad decision here with a girl because I don't want to be alone. I want to make a bad decision with a guy because I don't want to be alone. I'm going to make a bad decision here because I don't want to lose my job. I'm going to take an exit off the highway of God's will because I don't want to, you know what I'm saying? You got to come back and make that decision. Now what? When there's stress, what are you going to turn to? When there's difficulty, what are you going to turn to? When it looks like you could lose your job, what are you going to do? When it looks like you're going to be alone, what do you do? They're right back at hard times. Things haven't changed that much. Now they got to go back home, fix up an old home place. It's the beginning of the harvest, but they don't have any crops in. It's difficult to feed the family, just like it was when they left 10 years ago. Now, just be encouraged to know you're not the first one. Some of you are back up there. You've taken that first little difficult journey, and you're back there, and you're like, I thought this was supposed to improve. I thought it was supposed to help something that I'm following Jesus. I just talked to a guy just a few days ago, and he said, man, I've been doing good for a while. It just seems like, and he was talking about how he's not able to get a job right now and things. It's hard. It's hard. Let me teach you something. This is one of the most valuable things I ever learned. There's a law in the Bible called the law of sowing and reaping. It says that whoever sows to the flesh, the sinful desires, the desires of your sinful nature, whoever sows to the flesh will from the flesh reap destruction. But whoever sows to the Spirit will reap a harvest of everlasting life, of blessing. You spend your life, or years perhaps of it, sowing to the flesh, making bad choices, being immoral in this area, being dishonest in that area, being disobedient to the Lord in that area. You sow that crop for a while, and when the harvest starts coming in, it stinks. It's awful. It is painful. It's brokenness. My life is hurting, and it's painful. And so maybe at that moment you hear God's call and you turn back toward Him and you say, all right, I'm going to start sowing a different seed now. I'm going to sow the right kind of seed. I'm sowing seeds of honesty. I'm sowing seeds of obedience and commitment and trustworthiness and faithfulness in the little things. Now here's the problem. The hardest section of your life is going to be that little section when the old harvest is still coming in when you're throwing a different kind of seed. Because we get really impatient. We don't remember that it took about a year or 5 years or 10 years of sowing the bad seed before the bad harvest started coming in. We forget that part. and we throw good seed for a day or a week or a month, and we want everything to turn around in that period of time because we don't see the new good harvest coming in yet, and we're like, seriously? Seriously? I've been going to church for like 2 whole weeks. I've been going to church for like 6 months, man, and nothing is different. Everything is still about the same. It's just not turning around. This ain't working for me. And you know what? Here's the temptation. We go right back into hard times. We go right back into bad choices. We're already back at hard times. We're just tempted to go right back around the cycle again. Making that downward turn. Taking another exit off the highway. That's the temptation. All of a sudden it's like, let's get off here again, because it's way easier to go over here than it is to stay with this hard times, especially when I'm throwing the different kind of seed. I'm sowing something else now. I'm not sowing what I used to, and I don't see any difference. That's a hard season, but if you can stick with it, for a little while longer, it may be 6 months or a year before you really start seeing the changes, before you really start seeing the blessings of what you're sowing start coming back to you. It might be. It could be longer than that. I just want to encourage you, if you'll stick with it, you'll start seeing this harvest, the old bad seed harvest, you'll start seeing it start tapering off, and you'll start seeing the new harvest start coming in. If you'll stick with it a little bit longer, by God's grace, I think you're going to see something good. Don't quit in the hard times. But Daryl, you say, how? How do I not quit? What does that exit look like off of the path? What does that exit off of this cycle, this negative cycle where it just goes hard times, bad choices, broken lives, right back around again? How do I get off of that cycle? How do I make the leap to a different kind of cycle? Let me try to explain that today. Okay, I want to give you some background here to what happens when they get back to Bethlehem, and it's hard times and it's difficult to feed the family. There was a background. The background of this is that there were some gleaning laws. They called them gleaning laws. Here's what that means. In the Old Testament, if you were harvesting your wheat and you're cutting it down with a sickle, you're out there in your field, you're swinging the sickle, and the wheat, you chop it and put it in your bundle, and you chop it and put some more in your bundle, and hack some more and put it in your bundle. What you drop, you're not allowed to pick up, according to God's law. You're not allowed to go back and go back over the section you just harvested and pick up the extra heads of grain, the extra stalks that you cut down. Not allowed to do that. You're supposed to leave those for poor people. You're supposed to leave those for people who are coming along behind you who don't have fields, or they're having hard times, their crops failed for whatever reason, or they were injured back during the sowing season. You understand? All kinds of different possibilities. You're supposed to leave that for the poor people to come along behind, and they get the dignity of working and making some income for themselves. And it does cost you something, but it's a way to remember and honor the Lord by remembering the poor. And so if you did that, in fact, if you left a sheaf, a set of you bind up the stalks, and bind them up in your field. If you left one out there when you were carrying them back to the barn, you're not allowed to go back and get it. You got to leave it there so that the poor in your town, the poor in your area can be blessed by that. And God said, He said, if you'll keep these, I'll bless you for it. So the gleaning laws mean that when they get back home, they don't have any harvest. They're going to have to go glean. There's going to be some hard work involved. There's going to be a lot of back-breaking, bending over to pick up hour after hour, picking up, hunting for the dropped pieces of grain, dropped heads of grain. We're going to look and try to pick those up. I'm going to throw them into a bag or into an apron of some kind, and going to carry that back, and that's going to be my harvest. That's what's going to feed my family through these winter months. So when they get back to Bethlehem, they know what's in front of them, somewhat. But look at what happens in verse number 19. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" And she said, "Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Let me just stop and say, isn't that amazing? She's pointing back to when it was famine time, when it was hard to feed the family back then, when it was a husband, but she had a husband and 2 sons. And she points back and says, I was full back then. Those were the good days. Those were the good days. What am I talking about? I'm saying she's right back at hard times. She's just more broken than she was before. And she's pointing back and saying, the good times are back there when I was with the people of God. I was there. It was hard, yeah, but good times. Now I'm empty. I'm broken. And I want you to look at her attitude, because there were 2 choices. There were 2 choices that they have to make. You see, God's providence has taken from them, that He allowed them to go to Moab. He allowed them to lose family members. He allowed their life to be hard and painful in Moab. They get back, and now life is still hard and painful. And God's providence, in the face of God's providence, they're faced with 2 possible choices. And you're going to face the same 2 choices. Ready? The first one is bitterness. That's the first option. And that's the one Naomi picks. Naomi says, call me Mara, for the Almighty has made my life very bitter. She's a bitter old woman, a bitter mother-in-law. Nobody's going to marry her now. She's not going to have more kids now to hold. Life's going to be difficult. I expect that she's probably broken down physically as well. It's been a hard life for her, and she's not able to do a lot of things. She's getting very much older. So Naomi, verse 22, returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem just as the barley harvest was beginning. When you get back around to the top of that cycle, and it's hard times, please hear me, your temptation will be to get bitter against God. I just talked to a girl this week who lost her husband. She was trying to, she came back to the Lord. She had gotten addicted to things, and she's come back to God. And now she's saying, man, why my husband? Why? I'm so angry, she said, at God. I'm so angry at God. Why my husband? Why me? You see what I'm saying, right? You get the choice. You get the choice. You're going to face the choice of, is God fair? Is His providence bitter to me? Has He treated me unfairly? And in Naomi's world here, there's no, I blew it. You see that? Like, there's no, I made this so stupid choice. Why did I not just tell Elimelech, you can go to Moab if you want, but I'm staying here? Why didn't I do that? There's none of that. It is, God has afflicted me. God has made my life bad. I can't believe He did this to me. Why has He not been fair? That's her attitude. And I'm telling you, if it hadn't have been for Ruth, Naomi would have gone right back around the cycle. I don't know what the bad choice you make this time would have been, because I doubt she's going to go back to Moab. But I'm just saying, she'd have gone right back around the cycle, because she was choosing bitterness in her life. She was choosing to be bitter. What are you going to choose? What are you going to choose when you come back to the Lord and it's still hard? And your life is difficult because of choices that were made, because of sin that was committed, because of bondage that was hard to break. What's your choice going to be? What is your decision going to be when it is difficult and hard to serve the Lord for a period of time? Are you going to say, God's not fair to me? God's not fair to me. It's not right. It's not right. He should have done this. He should have done that. He could have done this. Yes, but He didn't. So what about that? What are you going to do? Are you going to choose bitterness? Now, if you're going to make the leap, if you're going to make the leap to the next level, you're going to have to choose something different than Naomi. Or maybe we should call her Mara now. Naomi means pleasant, the pleasant one. Mara, she said, call me Mara. It means bitter. She's admitting she's a bitter mother-in-law. Nobody likes bitter mother-in-laws, right? Ruth's got to put up with one. If you're going to make the leap, you're going to have to choose the other option. You got one choice that's bitterness. You got the other choice, and it is this, faith. You know what? I forgot to give you these blanks. Let me give you these. Bitterness is the enemy of redemption. It is. It is, because your attitude of bitterness will short-circuit what God is doing in your life. Here's the thing that bitterness fails to see. It fails to see that God's providence is not done working. Bitterness fails to see that God's providence is not done working. At this moment, it may seem like His providence is bitter, but it is not. It is not. It is sweet. It is bittersweet. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. God's providence is not done working in your life. So let me just tell you, Cornelius, Lori, Tony, Sarah, Daryl, Missy, maybe there are some areas in your life where because of different past choices, your life seems bitter. God's providence, the things He's allowed into your life, seem like they're a bitter pill to swallow. But please hear me when I say, God's providence is not done working. It is not done working. He is going to turn some things around. His providence is going to turn out to be bittersweet, not bitter. Here's the other option. Faith. Faith. Look at what Ruth decided. She said, I'm going to choose a different attitude. She said, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Do you see that? Do you see that? She's expecting that she's going to find favor. She's expecting, I'm going to work hard and I'm going to find favor. I'm going to pull the trigger on some things I know I've got to do that are right and righteous, whether and I know that I'm going to find favor in somebody's eyes. I'm going to work hard and I'm going to find favor. It takes faith to do that. That's a choice of faith. That's a choice not to be bitter about your lot in life. She's coming to her mother-in-law and she's saying, would you allow me to go take care of both of us? Would you allow me to go out and bear the scorn of the community and have people whisper out behind their hand, you know, that that's that Moabite girl that came with Naomi. Oh, my Moabite here in Israel. How terrible. She's going to go out and she's going to be picking up grain for both of them, supplying the needs for both of them. What respect in this girl. What character. We're going to talk about that a little bit as we go on. But I want you to notice the faith that she has when she says, I'm going to work hard and God's going to give me favor in somebody's eyes. I'm going to have favor in somebody's eyes. Please hear me on this. Some of you, you're at that hard time, you're in that hard season, and you need to make a decision. Which way am I going to go? What direction am I going to choose? Am I going to choose bitterness or am I going to choose faith? If you're going to choose faith, let me tell you how that looks. It looks like a guy here in our church that recently came back to the Lord after a difficult, hard moment in his life. And he came back and he was discouraged and depressed and down. And he got up and decided, I do have to go get a job. It's hard to get a job with the background, the record that I've got, but I do have to. And so he went out and started actually aggressively seeking for jobs. Now, he spent a little time where he was depressed and discouraged and really didn't look. He didn't really work. But one day he picked himself up and said, I'm going to go look. And you know what? He had a job within just a few days. He found somebody in whose eyes he found favor. And God is picking up some of those broken pieces, and by God's grace, now he's making a living. Thank God. A couple of weeks ago, I put on Facebook about a guy named Tim Fott who goes to our church here. Tim came to us about 2 years ago. He came to us straight out of jail. The very day he got out of jail, he came here that night, and he had found the Lord in jail. And he had repented of sin and believed in Jesus. And now he's been trying to sow the right kind of seed for almost 2 years now. The problem is he's still got some court cases pending from back in there. And now they're trying to send him away for several years to prison. And he was discouraged and down and saying, man, it's so frustrating. I've been doing the right thing. And what's going to happen? And here's the problem. I don't know altogether what's going to happen. What we need is for God to give us favor. We need God to give us favor in the eyes of some judges and some prosecutors. That's what we need. Because God has changed his life, and if he has to pay for crimes from that area, then so be it. If that's what the Lord's providence sends to him, then God's going to turn it around and make it bittersweet, not bitter. But I do know this. Do you understand why that's a hard season in his life? Because the old harvest is still coming in. He's been throwing the right kind of seed. He's trying to serve the Lord and pray and read the scriptures and come to church and be involved and not get high. And all of a sudden, here we are where the new harvest isn't fully in yet, and he's still reaping from the past years. That's a hard season. But you know what? I'm seeing a choice of faith. I'm seeing a choice of faith that he can make. And by God's grace, Tim's going to make it. Tim's going to make it. We're going to get this thing figured out. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that God's providence is going to be not bitter, but bittersweet for him. Now, what about you? What does that look like for you? A bittersweet providence and a faith that says, I choose to continue working and expect that God's going to find favor. Let me tell you, it means that if it's difficult from past relationships, you go through them with grace. You reach out and try to repair the relationship. You may get your hand bit, but you reach out and you try to repair that relationship as best you possibly can. You write some letters of apology and repentance, reaching back, trying to repair some of those things. You go out and you get a job, and you work hard and faithfully, because the Bible says, whoever is faithful in that which is least is also faithful in much. That's how that looks. She's doing that. She's just going to go out and be faithful to glean as best she can. She's expecting God's going to give her favor. You go do that. Maybe it means that for the last 10 years, you've not been sowing into your family like you ought to, and to your marriage like you ought to, and to your children like you ought to. Maybe the seeds that you've sown have not been good ones, and you're still reaping that harvest in your relationship and your kids and your wife. In that case, here's what you do. You be faithful, and you go do the little things, and you learn how to change your attitudes and change your responses and change your attitude. You throw the right kind of seed. You teach and train your children. You relate to them. You build bridges, not burn them. And in that process, you keep pouring into them, even when it seems like they're spitting back at you. You keep pouring into that. Why? Because you've chosen faith. You've chosen faith. I'm going to go to the glean in the fields, and I'm going to find favor in somebody's eyes. God's going to give me favor. And there's going to be a time where some of those things, you start to see the changes happening. You start to see the changes happening. Just don't get bitter and go around the cycle again. Don't do that. You see, God's providence is not bitter. It is bittersweet. I want you to look at this. Ruth chapter 2 actually, verse 3. As it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz. Now, I love this. Naomi in Ruth 2:1 had a relative, a man of standing, whose name was Boaz. Good guy. We're going to talk about Boaz in the next couple of weeks here. But I just want to point out, as it turned out, okay, do you understand that the same God who, as it turned out, allowed her husband to die, is now, as it turned out, sending her to the only man who can change her life. The man who's going to help redeem her and pick up the broken pieces of her life. He's the only man who legally is able, one of only men in the whole country of Israel who's legally able to do this. It is a fantastic story. As it turned out, oh no, there is no as it turned out. There's no as luck would have it. There is a God whose providence is sweet. It is bittersweet. In fact, here's what I want you to do. I want you to get out the little bag of chocolate chips that you came. I hope they didn't melt in your hand while you were here. Get out that little bag of chocolate chips. And maybe you need to pop a couple in your mouth. If you're not a chocolate person, fine. But here's what they are. They're not milk chocolate chips. They're semi-sweet chocolate chips. They're semi-sweet chocolate chips. And the reason I picked those is because when you put them in your mouth, there's a bitter twist to that cocoa, isn't there? There's a bitter turn to a semi-sweet chocolate chip. It's not perfectly sweet, but it's just enough sweet with the bitter to where they're not bitter, they're bittersweet. And maybe you need to pop a couple of those in your mouth, and as you taste them, maybe you need to remember. Maybe you need to remember that there is a God who is working on your side. And if you will allow your faith not to be distracted off and allow it to become bitter, don't allow your faith to become turned into, and your heart turned into bitterness where you've got an attitude with God all the time. Savor those tastes of that chocolate, that bittersweet, and say to yourself in your heart, God's providence is not bitter, it is bittersweet. You see, God's providence is not bitter, it is bittersweet, but it takes the choice of faith to see that. And as we go ahead into the next couple of chapters, we're going to see God's providence turn around out of a place where he allowed this girl's husband to die. He's going to turn it around, and now he's going to allow her to coincidentally work in the same place, be introduced to a man. A man's going to notice her, and it's going to change everything in her life because God's providence is not bitter. It is bittersweet. Don't you give up. You keep going because God is not done with you. Would you bow your heads with me? Let's pray.